I'm Netta, Phillet, Secretary-Treasurer of Project Ploughshares Edmonton. Since 1986, we have worked locally on many aspects of peacemaking, with the sure knowledge that unless all citizens of the world live in peace and security, our future is in peril. Our existence as a not-for-profit society has been supported by generous benefactors, Mary Polodnikov and Tony Mockery, whose names are on our Lifetime Achievement Award, and most notably Dr. Alice and Scott Lorentzos, who in 1995 chose us to establish an annual prize in the name of her late husband, Salvos. We had been planning a major event to commemorate 75 years since the inhumane tragedy of the massacres in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but sadly this cannot be. I will now quote from the summer 2020 issue of a Project Ploughshares Monitor article written by Executive Director Cesar Jaramillo, titled Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, a Worrying COVID Casualty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, widely considered the bedrock of the global nuclear disarmament regime, has not been immune to COVID-19. The latest in a series of review conferences, RevCons, of the NPT states parties, which are held every 5 years, was to have taken place this past May at UN headquarters in New York, but was postponed. However necessary, this constitutes a great blow to nuclear disarmament efforts. While meetings of NPT state parties are always significant, several factors underscored the critical importance of this year's gathering. The breakdown in the strategic relationship between Russia and the U.S. was perhaps most significant, but also critical were the long unfulfilled objective of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, in the Middle East, the overt policy of nuclear deterrence endorsed by all members of NATO, and the growing impatience by non-nuclear weapon states over the lack of credible progress towards nuclear disarmament. In March of this year, state parties to the NPT marked the 50th anniversary of the treaty's entry into force, yet nuclear weapons still exist. The complete and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons is long overdue, and while the NPT has been instrumental in addressing the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and peaceful uses of nuclear energy, it has failed to deliver nuclear abolition, a fundamental objective of the UN. Nuclear disarmament, as distinct from right sizing and reconfiguration of nuclear arsenals, is a non-priority for the US, and for China, and Russia, and the United Kingdom, and France, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty recognized nuclear weapon states. And no one is predicting that Israel, Pakistan, India, or North Korea, all outside the NPT framework, will give up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. And so the question today is not only if the world is better off with the NPT than without it, but whether this treaty will actually lead to complete nuclear disarmament. History does not encourage optimism. The last RevCon, held in 2015, failed to reach agreement on a consensus outcome document, typically seen as a minimum measure of success. Such a failure indicated profound shortcomings and difficulties with the nuclear abolition enterprise. Had this year's RevCon been held, there would likely have been considerable denunciation and lamentation from civil society and many states about the shortcomings of a deteriorating nuclear disarmament regime, as well as the increasing risk of a nuclear weapons catastrophe. The fragile strategic stability between the U.S. and Russia, which together possess approximately 95% of the world's nuclear weapons, has some international observers worried, and with good reason. The past few years have seen the undoing of many of the arms control agreements that provided the little predictability present in the relationship between the two superpowers. The combative personalities of both national leaders do little to diffuse tensions. In August 2019, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty between the U.S. and Russia, which bans certain types of ballistic missiles, expired amid mutual accusations of treaty violations. This past May, the Trump administration announced its intention to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty, which allows for unarmed reconnaissance flights over the territory of parties to the treaty. Again, they each issued accusations of non-compliance against the other. The consequential new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which places a limit on the number of deployed warheads held by the U.S. and Russia, is set to expire next February, but there seems little traction to renew it under current leadership. The pursuit of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East has been a thorny source of disagreement. Besides a concrete commitment made under the framework of the 95 NPT RevCon, no such zone exists. Several states, notably in the Arab world, are keen to see progress on this objective, but the road to it is rocky. The near collapse of the Iran nuclear deal, which has been unraveling since the Trump administration announced its unilateral withdrawal from the agreement in 2018, will almost certainly make the achievement of the Mideast goal considerably harder and could derail the next RevCon. The stationing of U.S. nuclear weapons in the territories of non-nuclear weapon states, Belgium, Turkey, Italy, and the Netherlands, is seen by many to directly contravene Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT. Recurring challenges to this arrangement at earlier NPT gatherings did not persuade NATO to amend its practice of sharing nuclear weapons, which members of the alliance strongly and unapologetically endorse. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is another recurring hurdle to broader nuclear disarmament. However, there could be fertile ground for creative diplomatic solutions if negotiators can link nuclear weapons with the official end to hostilities and a peace agreement between the North and South. The step-by-step approach long advocated by nuclear weapon states and their allies has come under increased scrutiny and will certainly be challenged at future NPT meetings for its lack of depth and specificity. Although this pragmatic, stepped approach has been discussed repeatedly at past NPT meetings, a search of the documentation yields no response to key questions of substance and process. There is no well-articulated plan for nuclear abolition. The two key steps this approach emphasizes, ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the negotiation of a fissile material cutoff treaty, while important, have thus far been pursued in a haphazard, piecemeal manner with no clear linkage to an explicit and credible abolition effort. The universalization of the NPT has been a constant objective that remains elusive and with no near-term solution. The NPT is often touted as nearly universal, but is it? 4 of the 9 nuclear-armed states are outside its framework. It is unlikely that the international community would accept these countries as nuclear weapon states under the NPT regime, and just as unlikely that these 4 states would agree to join the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. How could the NPT be seen as a realistic vehicle to zero nuclear weapons when almost half of the states with nuclear weapons are neither bound by its obligations nor restricted by its limitations? The complete abolition of nuclear weapons must remain the ultimate goal, but in the meantime, NPT states parties should consider concrete actions that will decrease nuclear insecurity and encourage disarmament. Shalom and thank you.
Hello, I'm Doug Roche. I'm a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament and former senator. And I'm here with you today to mark the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A tragic day for the world indeed. More than 200,000 people lost their lives, and the nuclear age began. And we've witnessed in these 75 years the rise and fall and rise again of a nuclear arms race. During the Cold War, there were many thousands of nuclear weapons. And we thought when the Cold War ended that the problem would go away. But it didn't. And in fact, there are now, today, all these years later, still 13,400 nuclear weapons possessed by 9 countries. 93% of these weapons are held by the United States and Russia, which today have entered a period of disunity, no negotiations, a renewed arms race with modernization of their stocks, huge amounts of money being spent. And so it is quite true to say that the extent of the danger today is greater than it was even during the Cold War, because the architecture for nuclear disarmament, the treaties that have at least held states together, are falling apart, principally because of the conduct of the United States and also Russia and China too. So this new period that we have entered into of danger has aroused a public opinion among governments and civil society And so in 2017, there was adopted at the United Nations a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This treaty was signed by 122 states, and it needs 50 to ratify it, to bring it into existence. And when this treaty comes into force, it will outlaw the possession of nuclear weapons. But of course, only the countries that ratify it will abide by it. And we have to work hard to get Canada on board. So this moment that we're passing through is a moment of great danger and also a new moment of opportunity. We can move forward if we will take to heart a message that is given to us by a very strange teacher indeed. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, it changed the dynamic of how we understand security. All through the nuclear age, governments thought that security depended on military armaments. We had to have bigger and better stocks than the supposed enemy. And that, of course, that idea was fed constantly by the military-industrial complex. When COVID struck, it showed how vulnerable all of humanity is. That no amount of armies and no nuclear weapons will preserve us, will save us in our desire for human security. What we have to have is cooperation among states to pool their resources and to recognize that we are all one together. COVID has brought to the fore the need for a common security agenda. That was expressed perhaps most clearly, most succinctly by Presidents Gorbachev and Reagan in 1986, when they both affirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But that idea has been lost in the growing and the escalation that we've had now of nuclear armaments in the age that we're now living in. So we have an opportunity to move forward. Indeed, we have an obligation to do so. We need to find a way to have our own safety, the safety of all those around the world, recognized as a common safety. And so the way in which we need to move forward is through a much stronger civil society, a recognition among civil society that we can help to move the agenda. We need to press governments forward to a recognition that the policies they're making have to be designed for a culture of peace, that a human security agenda does not depend on the amount of armaments, but on the amount of how we are making people secure. And that translates very, very demonstrably into less money for arms and more for human development. The $1.9 trillion that the world is spending on arms today is outrageous, and the $100 billion a year on nuclear weapons is absolutely unacceptable. So we must take this moment in which the COVID has made us recognize that we are one, to recognize that we have to press our governments. That is what we can do. We press our government, press our politicians, letters to the MPs, letters to the Prime Minister, to make our will known, our public will known, that we will not tolerate the continued expansion of nuclear weapons and the modernization of all these weapons in an age when what our security our security depends on how much we will invest in health, education, housing, all the components of a human security agenda. That is the real lesson that we take and we learn from Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago today.
There's a saying that war is bad for children and other living things. This is a song about the children. Crimson sky, sleepless night, there we'd hide, holding on tight. We were born by the sea, innocence, lusterly, in those moments when we knew each other. We were flowers in a garden, raindrops in a river, falling leaves in autumn. And I am still here, though you walk behind in silence. I am still here. Siren sound, off we run, underground, till it's done. A final blast shakes the core. Happen fast, then no more. In those moments when we knew each other, we were flowers in a garden, raindrops in a river, falling leaves in autumn. And I am still here, though you walk behind in silence. I am still here, still here, still here. And I am still here, still here, still here. And I am still here.
So August 6, 1945, yes, was the bombing of Hiroshima by American forces. And I find it to be interesting to talk about the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and 75 years later. And what I find interesting when we talk about it and what it makes me think about is how in 1945, around that same, 3 months later, we had the Convention on Prevention of Genocide, and really, for me, the atomic bombings were a form of genocide, and it's just an interesting kind of juxtaposition. But 75 years later, when we look back and we think about why does that matter? Why do we need to remember it? I think now more than ever, and it's interesting with the situation that we're in with COVID right now, I don't think many of us are thinking about international politics, international relations, and how that's playing out, because the energies are very centered on the response to this pandemic. However, the realities are, even a year ago, there was an acceleration of the arms race. And there was concern that America, Russia, China, even Iran, that there's more developments in the nuclear field. So I think it is still really relevant. It is something that needs to be on our trajectory and something that we're thinking about and talking about. Because when we're looking at the poverty on our streets, and when we're looking at all the challenges that we face on a daily basis, and when we look at the expenditures that go into the arms race, and the expenditures that go into this military-industrial complex, we start to question about how we can ever address the disparities in our world, and how we can ever really fulfill the human rights within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yeah, and it was interesting this morning, thinking about this. One of the projects I've been working on for some time, and it just is always a side project, is building a curriculum around genocide for schools. And I'm reading this and I'm realizing how critical it is, because I think a lot of teachers and even people are afraid to talk about genocide. They're afraid to talk about these issues, but yet if we're afraid to talk about them, they don't remain in our memory. And if they don't remain in our memory, we'll never continue to learn. And I think this connection to these historical events 75 years ago and these bombs, and really kind of portray the challenging nature that we face with the international relations, international politics, because it's not so simple to say never again when there are countries that are working on their nuclear bombs, and there is current work on this, and I think there is a lack of mobilization around these issues nowadays, and I really wish there was more conversations around not only what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but what's happening today and what the connections are. Because while we may live in a world where we seem like things are quite okay, aside from the COVID, we consume, we go to work, we have our cars, we have all these pieces of the puzzle, but they're all tied into this bigger structure of production and industry, and military is a huge piece of that. And the arms race is a huge piece of that, and the amount of resources that go into these arms races is a huge element that we need to be thinking about and talking about. So when we're thinking about accountability of our government, whether it's accountability of the dollars that we spend maybe on COVID responses, or whether it's the dollars that we're spending on housing those that most need it, we also need to be looking at the dollars that are being spent and going into military. And so when I think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's what I think about. I think about our need to really center what that means for us today, and really center on this idea that the military and industry in that sense takes a huge piece of our budgets, but it's also something that we're not talking about critically. Aside from organizations like Project Ploughshares, it's not front and center in the conversations. And so I think in reflecting back on the 75 years, that's what I see as critical, is this renewal of conversations and renewal of energy around these issues of the nuclear arms race, and around issues of genocide, because it's alive and real, and while we may think it was 75 years ago and it's not relevant, those issues are still alive and prominent. And with COVID right now, and as part of the work I do, we are seeing an increase in hate. We are seeing an increase of hate crime and hate incidences, and those are directed a lot of times at the Asian community right now. So we have to be really conscious about the relevance of this conversation today.
August 6th will mark the 75th anniversary of the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb that exploded above Hiroshima, the Japanese city, killing about 140,000 people immediately, and Later on, probably about 237,000 estimated suffering from injuries from the blast. 3 days after that, they dropped another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, immediately killing 8,500 people and eventually resulting in the deaths of more than 70,000 due to exposure to radiation injuries. The given explanation was it was to hasten the end of the Second World War, but this, of course, was totally false. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima by the U.S. had no military value whatsoever because Japan had already capitulated, had already surrendered. The bombings were aimed at threatening and trying to intimidate the world's people, especially the people of the Soviet Union, who had been instrumental in defeating the Nazi aggressors at the cost of 10 million lives and many millions more wounded. So it was the Soviet Union that had emerged after the Second World War as the leading force for liberation and peace for all nations and peoples. And the U.S. was soon shocked to receive the news that the Soviet Union also possessed nuclear weapons. This kind of provided a counterweight to the U.S. blackmail and was a great encouragement for all the peoples who were fighting for their liberation. The dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki served notice that the U.S. would commit any crime to establish its hegemony over Europe and Asia and defeat communism. The Canadian government was directly involved in facilitating production of the bomb, among other things by providing enriched uranium. In fact, unprotected Dene ore carriers transported dangerous uranium on their backs to feed the U.S. war machine, leading to later sky-high rates of cancer in their communities. Canadian ministers did know in advance the bomb would be used on the Japanese people, so they participated knowingly in its construction. August 6th and August 9th have now become days to commemorate those killed in these acts of terrorism by the U.S., and to express the collective determination of the people of Canada and the world to never again permit crimes such as that against humanity. This takes on even greater urgency in a world where U.S. imperialism gives it the right to launch preemptive nuclear strikes against any nation or people, as it has threatened to do against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or the Iran. Today, 75 years later, the threat of a nuclear holocaust that would annihilate humanity remains a reality. The U.S. imperialists under President Trump continue to be leaders by far in producing and selling, stockpiling nuclear weapons that are capable of wiping out the entire planet many times over. Trump takes no principled stand against proliferation of nuclear weapons, and he is certainly not going to start by having the U.S. give up its immense stockpile. The imperialists need the biggest nuclear stockpile to reinforce their Nazi logic of might makes right, and to threaten any country that takes a stand in defense of its own independence and sovereignty. At the same time, the allies and clients of U.S. imperialism, such as serial war criminal Israel, are also encouraged to produce nuclear weapons, which is in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other international laws, to threaten aggression on neighboring states in the name of so-called self-defense and war on terror. There is no possibility of peace in the world when U.S. imperialism and its allies can impose these double standards with impunity in violation of international laws and conventions that humanity has brought forward. And this is interesting, especially in view of Trudeau just accusing Russia of violating international law. In the face of these brutal double standards, countries such as DPRK see themselves forced to build and test nuclear weapons as a deterrent against the constant nuclear blackmail of the U.S. It is the U.S. and the Allies who have to be held responsible, though, for creating this very dangerous situation that forces small countries like DPRK to arm themselves with nuclear weapons in the interests of self-preservation. The crimes committed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki will not go away by threatening the DPRK, Iran, and other countries for posing an alleged nuclear threat. It is unacceptable that those who used nuclear weapons in the past on an already defeated foe to blackmail the entire world's people today threaten the use of nuclear preemptive strikes under the pretext of acting in the interests of peace and human security. Hiroshima Day and Nagasaki Day highlight precisely that it is the U.S. imperialists who have used nuclear weapons against the people of Japan and are openly threatening to do so against the people of Korea and Iran today. They are falsely portraying those who defend themselves against U.S. aggression as being the ones who are destabilizing international relations and creating conflicts and wars. Today, the U.S. imperialists and their allies in Canada around the world want to divide the world between democratic and failed states and others that are uncivilized and so on, to justify their drive to dominate the whole world with their aim of plundering human and natural resources. The current occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan show their main aim is to humiliate and defeat all those who affirm their right to be. Under Donald Trump, the U.S. continues to build the military bases. They already have approximately 1,000, and move troops around the world to threaten their main rivals such as Russia and China, as well as any country that tries to affirm its right to independence. The peoples of the world have direct experience with U.S. imperialism and its allies since the Second World War and before. For example, military coups in Guatemala and Iran, aggression against Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba, attacks on Libya and Syria, and countless other examples. But the people of the world have shown they cannot be suppressed through force. Humanity's fight to rid the world of nuclear weapons and defeat the U.S. imperialist New World Order requires stepping up the struggle to uphold the sovereignty and independence of all nations and eliminate the threat or use of force to settle conflicts. It necessitates that the Canadian working class and people put in place an anti-war government that rejects the use of force as a means of settling conflicts between nations and peoples. Canada must withdraw from all aggressive military blocs and treaties such as NATO and NORAD, and demand that all nuclear states dismantle their respective nuclear arsenals, beginning with the United States. On this occasion, we pay our deepest respects to the Japanese victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to all people the world over who have suffered and continue to suffer as a result of imperialist dictate. The imperialist system led by the U.S. is criminal, and it must be ended by the political unity of all the fighting peoples of the world if ever peace is to prevail.
The song is called "The Band Played Waltzing Matilda." It's the story of a young Australian soldier who was drafted into the Australian Army as part of the Australia and New Zealand force that went to Gallipoli. Gallipoli was a disaster for the British Empire. They tried to control the Dardanelles and failed. They tried to conquer Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and they failed there also. Of the Anzac forces, there were 7,000 casualties within the first 3 days. An observation plane overhead reported that the sea was red with the blood of the soldiers on the beaches. It's quite a tragic story all around. How when I was a young lad I carried me pack, and I lived the free life of the rover. From the Murray's green basin to the dusty outback, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Then in 1915, my country said, "Son, it's time to stop rambling, there's work to be done." And they gave me a tin hat, and they gave me a gun, and they sent me away to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as our ship pulled away from the quay. And amid all the cheers and flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli. How well I remember that terrible day when our blood stained the sand and the water, and how in that hell that they call Suvla Bay we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was ready, he primed himself well, he rained us with bullets and he showered us with shells, and in 5 minutes flat we were all blown to hell. nearly blew us back home to Australia. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury our slain. And we buried ours, and the Turks buried theirs, and it started all over again. Those who were living just tried to survive in that mad world of blood, death, and fire. And for 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive, though around me the corpses piled higher. Then a big Turkish shell knocked me arse overhead, and when I awoke in me hospital bed and saw what it had done, I wished I were dead. Never knew there were worse things than dying, for no more I'll go waltzing a Matilda all around the green bush far and near. For to hunt tent and pegs, a man needs both legs. No more waltzing a Matilda for me. They collected the wounded, the crippled, the maimed, and they shipped us back home to Australia. The armless, the legless, the blind, the insane, those proud wounded heroes of Suvla. And when our ship pulled into Circular Quay, I looked at the place where my legs used to be, and thanked Christ there was no one there waiting for me to grieve and to mourn and to pity. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway, but nobody cheered. They just stood there and stared, and they turned all their faces away. So now every April I sit on my porch and I watch the parade pass before me. I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, renewing their dreams of past glory. I see the old men, all tired, stiff and sore, weary old heroes of a forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. And the band plays Waltzing Matilda, and the old men still answer the call. But year after year, old men disappear. Someday no one will march there at all. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? And their ghosts may be heard as they march by the billabong. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?
Hello everyone. Hiroshima Day is an occasion to reflect on the stand of the world's people for peace and against the threat of nuclear holocaust, as well, of course, to remember all those who died or were permanently injured by the criminal bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all those who have died in wars of aggression since that time. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Stockholm Appeal, as well as the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima. So I think it's fitting to speak about this appeal. In 1949, the first meeting of the World Congress of the Defenders of Peace met to prepare for the founding of a worldwide organization for peace. The Congress passed the following resolution, which I think is remarkably relevant still today. We stand for the UN Charter against all military alliances that nullify the Charter and lead to war. We are against the crushing burden of military expenditures, which is responsible for the poverty of the people. We stand for the banning of atomic weapons and other methods of mass extermination of human beings. We demand the limitation of the armed forces of the great powers and the establishment of effective international control over the use of atomic energy for exclusively peaceful ends and for the good of humanity. We strive for the national independence and peaceful cooperation of all peoples, for the right of peoples to determine their own future, essential conditions for freedom and peace. We oppose all attempts to restrict and then destroy democratic liberties in order to prepare the way for war. We are the worldwide bulwark of truth and reason. We aim at neutralizing the propaganda which prepares public opinion for war. We condemn war hysteria, the preaching of race hatred and hostility between peoples. We urge the denunciation and boycott of newspapers, literary productions and films, individuals and organizations which make propaganda for a new war. In 1950, the newly founded organization, the World Peace Congress, issued the Stockholm Appeal, which I'm going to read to you as well. We demand the absolute banning of the atomic bomb, weapon of terror and mass extermination of populations. We demand the establishment of strict international control to ensure the implementation of this ban. We consider that the first government to use the atomic weapon against any country whatsoever would be committing a crime against humanity and should be dealt with as a war criminal. We call on all men of goodwill throughout the world to sign the appeal. And more than 562 million people in 64 countries signed the Stockholm Appeal. It expressed the unity of the people of the world against war and aggression for the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. Shortly after that, the Pact for Peace, which demanded that the big powers take action to eliminate all nuclear weapons, got 603,570,000 signatures. So I must, in the interest of time, jump to the present without really reviewing how exactly we got here with the development of the Cold War. But one thing to mention is that the idea was introduced that it is weapons which pose the danger, not imperialism, not aggression. And the other thing that was introduced was that keeping weapons in the hands of the nuclear club, that is the imperialist powers and those that they agree can have them, will be a method of ensuring peace. So today we have a nuclear club. The United States, Russia, the UK, France, China, as well as those the big powers permit to belong, India, Pakistan, and Israel. All others are banned from having nuclear weapons and are portrayed as the ones who pose the threat to peace. In particular, the DPRK, or you may know it as North Korea, and Iran, the U.S. has repeatedly used the threat and contemplated the use of nuclear weapons. That's very clear. In Korea, in Vietnam. Although they did not actually use nuclear weapons in Korea and Vietnam, they did use chemical and biological weapons, and they carried out the massacre of millions upon millions of civilians and continue to do so today. So this situation requires us as people who work for peace, who call for negotiations to resolve international conflicts, who stand up for the right of every nation to self-determination and to chart its own path, to consider seriously that within this situation we cannot agree that countries who feel they must develop nuclear weapons to defend themselves against threats of annihilation are the ones who should be targeted. And that is what Canada is doing in the world today. For us as Canadians, the urgent necessity is to end the integration of Canada into the U.S. war machine, which means getting out of NATO and NORAD, which are aggressive military alliances. It means ending Canada's interference and aggression against other countries and appeasing U.S. imperialism. It means an end to sanctions against countries who are charting their own path, like Venezuela, where Canada has declared that it has the right to decide who should be the president of Venezuela, and to actively work to undermine the elected government in Venezuela, as it did in Haiti, which imposes sanctions and has been taken a leading role on that front against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, who has been threatened, really since 1950 by the U.S. with the use of nuclear weapons, and who felt that they had no alternative but to develop nuclear weapons as self-defense against U.S. threats of annihilation. As Canadians, we want a Canada which is a factor for peace, so we must work for an anti-war government. A government that would uphold these basic principles, and of course, which would call for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. So, on this day, let us strengthen our resolve to build our anti-imperialist peace movement, to make Canada a zone for peace, to elect an anti-war government in Canada, to make sure that Canada is a factor for peace in the world and not war and aggression, to get out of NATO and NORAD, and to establish relations with the peoples of the whole world on the basis of mutual benefit, mutual understanding, peaceful negotiations, and an end to all war and aggression. Thank you.
Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Young girls pick them, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the young girls gone? Long time passing. Where have all the young girls gone? Long time ago. Where have all the young girls gone? Gone for young men, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? soldiers gone? Long time passing, where have all the soldiers gone? Long time ago, where have all the soldiers